Hello and welcome, or if you're a fan of our previous series of Oxford at Home, welcome back. Welcome now to a new series of special COP conversations, a mini-series leading up to the COP26 climate change discussions taking place in Glasgow, right here in the United Kingdom, next month, November. And I'm Rana Mitter. I teach Chinese history and politics, and China is obviously one of the subjects of great interest, not only to us here in Oxford, but in the wider world. But my role here, and for the next few weeks, is to introduce our very distinguished, very expert speakers from Oxford's scientific and other communities who are going to be talking about the relevance of COP and issues around it. And today, we have a speaker who is going to be giving us a talk on one of the most important areas in terms of thinking about how climate change might affect all of our lives. Nature-based solutions, which involve working with nature to address social challenges, providing benefits for human well-being and biodiversity. And that speaker is Professor Nathalie Seddon, Professor of Biodiversity and Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. Now, Nathalie has over 20 years of research experience in a range of ecosystems across the globe. She is Oxford's Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, but she also advises governments, United Nations agencies, and businesses on nature-based solutions. And she is a friend of COP26, and just in case that sounds like there might be quite a lot of those, in fact, it's a very special position, one of around only 30 global experts currently advising the UK government on its presidency of COP26. So we'll start with that in just a moment. Just a couple of pieces of housekeeping, if I may. Just remind you that Nathalie's talk today with about 15 minutes. We're going to start with a short animation, about 2 minutes or so long, and then we'll dive straight into Nathalie giving her talk. And that section will all last about a quarter of an hour. And then we'll have a further 15 minutes for questions. Do note there are many ways you can send in questions. You can do it on the chat window on YouTube. You can do it in the comment section of Twitter or Facebook. So don't be shy, send your thoughts and questions in, and we will pass the best ones on to Nathalie to answer during the Q&A session. Do remember also, we're still all doing this from different sorts of Wi-Fi and offices at home. So if there's a little glitch at any moment, just give us a moment. We will do our best to get everything back on the road. And with all those various bits and pieces, I think it's high time that we started our session. So with the animation to start, could I hand over to Nathalie?
Nature-based solutions can help fight climate change, biodiversity loss, and poverty. We live in a world where landscapes are dominated by farming and infrastructure, with very little space left for nature. Yet nature is our life support system, and with 1 million species at risk of extinction and extreme events increasing as the planet warms, people are suffering. But we can, and we must choose a different future. Nature-based solutions involve protecting our natural ecosystems, not just our forests, but also our peatlands, our wetlands, grasslands and marine habitats, through locally led projects that support communities. They encompass restoring degraded habitats, cleaning rivers and allowing them to meander again, and bringing microbes, plants and animals back into damaged landscapes. Nature-based solutions involve sustainably managing our working lands and fisheries and replenishing soil health. For example, by growing trees among crops and planting more hedgerows. And nature-based solutions also include bringing nature into our towns and cities, with connected parks, allotments, green roofs and ponds. But biodiversity must be at the foundation of all these activities, for it is only when ecosystems thrive that they can support people over the long term. And nature-based solutions can also only be sustained if they are designed and implemented by local communities, respecting indigenous knowledge, cultural traditions, and human rights. In this way, people and nature co-produce a variety of outcomes which benefit society, which in turn feed back to support biodiversity. Protecting nature can store carbon, whilst restoring it can draw greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and in this way, nature-based solutions can help to slow climate change this century. Restoration of habitats on slopes and in catchments can store water and stabilise soils, protecting our homes and crops by reducing the risk of floods, erosion and landslides. Healthy coastal ecosystems are also crucial for protecting communities from the impacts of storm surges, saltwater intrusion and erosion. While in our towns and cities, trees in parks and along pavements provide shelter from the sun and rain and reduce peak temperatures during heat waves. And by bringing nature into our cities, we can also improve our mental and our physical health. Nature-based agricultural practices can help to sustain or even enhance yields, securing food supplies and ensuring clean drinking water is available year-round. Furthermore, the restoration of our lands and seas can generate valuable jobs and provide diverse livelihoods, while securing supply chains. And in this way, nature-based solutions can support economic recovery all over the world. Nature has diverse cultural values, including enjoyment of natural beauty and spiritual and religious connections, all the while bringing education, recreation, and health benefits. Through implementing nature-based solutions, people build stronger relationships, networks, and knowledge, which gives them the capacity to adapt and to be resilient in a rapidly changing world. All of these benefits and more support human well-being and biodiversity, which are, in turn, the foundation of sustainable development.
So the science is very clear. Climate change and biodiversity loss are undermining the development gains of the 20th century and represent huge and increasing risks to the global economy and to businesses. Over half the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on a healthy planet. Yet without drastic emissions reductions, we will exceed 2 degrees of warming and lose between 0.5 and 1 million species this century, according to recent reports of the Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change and on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So our failure to slow biodiversity loss or to address climate change and the urgent need to stimulate economic recovery without exacerbating environmental damage demands that we very quickly scale up much more ambitious and coherent approaches to tackling these challenges. Now, nature-based solutions are one such family of approaches that have recently become very prominent in international policy and business discourse. For example, nearly half the world's nations have signed the UK-led Leaders' Pledge for Nature, and in so doing have committed to significantly scale up nature-based solutions, while 2/3 of the signatories of the Paris Agreement include nature-based solutions in one form or another in their climate pledges. And for the very first time, nature is a dominant theme at the upcoming UN Climate Change Summit COP26, where many major new funding streams and programs for nature-based solutions will be announced. As described in the animation that you've just seen, put very simply, nature-based solutions are actions that involve working with nature to address a whole range of different societal goals. So they include restoration, connection, and protection of both natural and semi-natural ecosystems, not only on the land, but of course also in the sea. They involve the sustainable management of our working lands and our seascapes, including our croplands and our timberlands. And they involve the establishment of new ecosystems, such as bringing nature or green infrastructure into our towns and cities. Now, this concept of a nature-based solution arrives from the very robust understanding that natural habitats support human societies in multiple ways, from providing clean water, clean food and shelter, to storing carbon, and critically to protecting us from the impacts of climate extreme events, such as floods and droughts and heat waves. The concept is also firmly grounded in the knowledge that biodiversity loss and climate change share some of the same drivers. So land use change, for example, through industrial agriculture, is both the biggest driver of biodiversity declines, accounting for about 30% of declines, and the second biggest source of greenhouse gases. So at least in theory, if we protect or enhance our carbon stores through the restoration, protection of our natural ecosystems, this can, in theory, both help to reduce warming whilst also slowing biodiversity declines. But the critical point to remember is this scenario, this win-win, or even this triple win scenario, is not guaranteed. Some so-called nature-based solutions, particularly those involving planting trees in areas where trees don't naturally occur, can have negative outcomes for both biodiversity and for local people, and in this way are not sustainable or effective. And I'm going to return to that, But first of all, what I want to do is outline what the latest research reveals about the key benefits, about the potential of nature-based solutions. So one of the most important aspects of nature-based solutions to keep in mind are the many critical ways in which they can support human adaptation to the climate change that's already locked into the system. You know, ecosystems along our coastlines, within our catchments, all over the place, provide natural barriers that can reduce the exposure of communities and infrastructure and agriculture to extreme events such as heat waves in cities or flooding along the coasts. Meanwhile, properly protected and sustainably managed, they can also limit our sensitivity to climate change, for example, by supporting diverse alternative sources of income and food during times of shortage. And they can increase our capacity to deal with future shock and changes, because all over the world, we see that social capital, as well as natural capital, is built through that process of protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing the natural world. Another key element of nature-based solutions is that, generally speaking, they also involve lower risk and lower cost than engineered alternatives. So according to various recent studies that have been published over the last few years, the benefits of, for example, mangrove restoration, so benefits such as fisheries, recreation, and disaster risk reduction, are up to 10 times the cost of restoring them. Meanwhile, it's been estimated that nature-based coastal defence projects are between 2 and 5 times more cost-effective compared to our engineered alternatives. We also know that annual damages from flooding would double and costs from storms would triple if we were to lose our coral reefs globally. So added to this, you know, nature can provide a sustainable source of income for local communities, and they can also generate many more jobs than investments in other sectors. For example, for every $1 million US invested in coastal habitat restoration in the USA, 40 new jobs are created. And this critically compares to around 19 for investment in the aviation industry and 5 for oil and gas. And some fairly recent analyses indicate that although the European Union is only spending 1% of its COVID economic recovery budget on nature, the job creation potential of increasing that would be huge, around 3.7 billion euros into nature restoration across just 4 countries would create around 170,000 jobs and 7 billion euros of economic activity over a period of 15 years. These are very, very big numbers. But can nature-based solutions also help us actually cool the planet? You know, you may have heard that nature-based solutions are being widely promoted as a key climate change mitigation solution. But there's a lot of confusion about nature's role in climate change mitigation. I mean, this is hardly surprising. The carbon cycle is very complex, and calculating that mitigation potential of nature is very challenging. You need to take into many different interacting biophysical, socioeconomic, even cultural factors, and you have to take into account the price of carbon. Nonetheless, there is a growing consensus around many different research groups all over the world working on this, but there's a growing consensus that the total mitigation potential of working with nature on the land is around 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year globally, or 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, so that is including other greenhouse gases. Now, as you can see, which I hope you can see from this figure here, 40% of this is estimated to come for just protecting what we've got left, protecting our intact forests or grasslands or wetlands or peatlands, so protecting the carbon that's locked up in the biosphere. 40% comes from managing existing working lands, so sustainably managing our working lands and using more nature-based agricultural practices such as agroforestry. And then the rest, 20%, comes from restoring native habitats, restoring degraded landscapes. And what we recently calculated is this amounts to reducing global warming by 0.1 of a degree if warming peaks around 1.5 degrees since pre-industrial time in the middle of the century. However, if we overshoot the 1.5 temperature degree of the Paris Agreement and warming peaks around 2 degrees towards the end of the century, there would be more time for the benefits of nature to accrue. And if scaled up to the maximum extent possible, they could reduce global warming by around 0.3 of a degree. In some ways, it seems like a small contribution to global cooling, but it becomes much more significant when you view it within the context of the severe social, economic, and ecological impacts of, say, a 1.5 degree warmer world compared to a 2. Nonetheless, there's no escaping the fact that the total potential of working with nature for the goal of climate change mitigation is much smaller than what must be achieved through decarbonisation of the global economy. Furthermore, and this is often forgotten, we must rapidly, unless we rapidly phase out fossil fuels, that mitigation potential of nature won't be realised, because climate warming will undermine the health of the biosphere and its capacity to draw down and store carbon or provide any of the benefits to society that I mentioned. So it's vitally important to understand that we must decarbonise, we must keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we must scale up protection, restoration of nature. It's not an either or. Now, as a result of this growing evidence and awareness of the potential of nature-based solutions for addressing climate change and biodiversity loss while supporting the economy, nature-based solutions have been gaining a lot of traction. However, alignment between biodiversity, climate change and adaptation and the economy is not at all guaranteed. And as I say, a lot of it depends on whether we are able to keep fossil fuels in the ground, whether we stop funding damage to our ecosystems in our supply chains, and whether we ensure that nature-based solutions are biodiversity-based and people-led. So biodiversity is very important. It's very important that biodiversity isn't overlooked. The more diverse an ecosystem is, the more able it is to resist and recover quickly from shocks and changes. Now, the extent to which to which a nature-based solution supports biodiversity varies a great deal. Protecting intact ecosystems or restoring degraded ecosystems to the natural state can deliver many significant benefits. However, if we put non-native tree plantations in areas such as intact ancient grasslands, peatlands, or woodlands, then the outcome for both carbon and biodiversity will generally be very poor. One of the other problems of the current focus or obsession with tree planting is that often plantations only offer very short-term, quite high-risk carbon stores. And that emphasis on plantations can also distract from the need to protect our intact ecosystems, which are much better at storing and drawing down carbon and storing it over the long term. And then there is also the problem is that in areas where regulatory frameworks are weak and land is easily appropriated, then there can be very poor outcomes for local communities. Yet these communities often have a great deal of knowledge about how to work with nature, and are currently playing a very important role in tackling the biodiversity and climate crisis. Therefore, they must be involved in making land use decisions. And if we ignore those cultural links that communities have with their local ecosystems as a source of livelihoods and identity, initiatives are not only deeply unethical, they're actually not sustainable over the long term. So, to be clear, nature-based solutions are these place-based partnerships between people and nature, and there isn't a silver bullet, there isn't one intervention that can be applied in a top-down fashion at scale. However, there are 4 evidence-based broad principles that can guide investments, which is a consortium of research, conservation, development organisations we are promoting in the build-up to COP26. And these guidelines basically acknowledge the deepening consensus about the critical importance of protecting, restoring, and connecting biodiverse habitats across landscapes for the wide range of benefits that they bring, and of ensuring that they are led by or developed in close partnership with local communities. There is also a broad agreement, as I've said, that nature-based solutions are not an alternative to keeping fossil fuels in the ground. The problem is that many high-emitting industries are investing in tree planting programs to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. And this has created a moral hazard wherein the simple but misguided narrative that planting trees will somehow stop climate change is encouraging business as usual. Moreover, these programs, to date at least, have tended to involve commercial plantations of exotic tree species. And while these are often labelled as nature-based solutions, they don't qualify as such for the reasons I've said. So it's very important, therefore, to hold to account or to ensure that those claiming to invest in nature-based solutions, A, have ambitious, incredible and verifiable actions to phase out the use of fossil fuels, and only support projects that are people-led and biodiversity-based. So the upcoming Global Climate Summit in November, COP26, is of course a major opportunity to catalyse the change, the systemic change that we need to get humanity onto a just and sustainable trajectory with nature-based solutions at its heart. Obviously, to enable this, the high-emitting nations of the world need to make robust commitments to increase near-term climate ambition, backed up with well-resourced and tractable action plans. And they need to establish a Paris-compliant forms of public and private finance that do not lock in long-term damage to the climate and the biosphere. Now, whatever the political landscape around emissions targets and climate finance ahead of COP26, the summit, I believe, holds genuine promise for the nature agenda. However, I think to be declared a successful nature COP, several things would need to happen. And I've got these 5 key things on the slide here that you can see. First of all, the COP26 decision text would need to acknowledge the critical role of biodiverse ecosystems in general, not only forests, in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and would commit to joint work programs on climate change and biodiversity loss between the 2 key Rio conventions, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. There needs to be much more synergy between the ways of working between these 2 programs. Second, we need to see much more enhanced ambition for nature in many countries, revised on new NDCs and national adaptation plans, in addition to, not instead of, increased ambitions on emissions reduction. Third, we need to see the widespread adoption of clear standards for nature-based solutions projects, such as those I've outlined in the previous slide. And we need commitments to defund ecosystem loss and damage and the abuse of human rights within supply chains sooner rather than later. And of course, finally, we need to see pledges, robust pledges for increased finance for nature-based solutions from governments, funding mechanisms under UNFCCC, multilateral development banks, and so forth. So to conclude now, working with nature, being careful stewards of our ecosystems is absolutely fundamental to creating flourishing, healthy societies and businesses. And it really shouldn't be the sole responsibility of the conservation community, but all our responsibilities. Nature is, after all, our life support system, and we ignore it or undervalue it at our peril. And the evidence from both science and practice for that has never been clearer. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Natalie. I think we've been given in a very short time an extremely wide-ranging and illuminating set of thinking points to put together. And you've kindly agreed to stay with us for another 10 minutes or so, just to answer some of the actually rather large number of questions that's coming in from our audience, and as we know from past events this sort, potentially around the world. Let me sneak in first, though, with a slightly parochial question, but I think a possibly helpful one. We are aware that the problems you're talking about are global ones, and of course we do have a global audience here today, but we're speaking from the United Kingdom, and actually we're speaking the day after the Prime Minister of this country made a speech to his governing party in which actually the question of how nature interacts with the changing economy and changing society was part of what he had to say. I won't go into details, but let's just say beavers, otters, and other wildlife were mentioned rather extensively. And I am aware that you have a role, amongst other things, in advising the UK government. So can I put you on the spot a little bit and say, how is the UK doing on some of these questions? And in particular, do you see any examples of either particularly good or bad practice from what's happening in our own country that we might want to consider as case studies for the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Well, it turns out there's a lot of extraordinarily wonderful things happening in this country. We have not served our biodiversity well. We have lost a lot of species. We have extremely degraded landscapes, both along the coast and inland and so forth. And we've lost a lot over the last few decades or centuries. But there are all sorts of groups all over the UK, lots of conservation organisations, county councils, local businesses, farming communities doing extraordinarily well in terms of restoring biodiversity, connecting landscapes, increasing habitats and increasing our resilience. So it's a wonderful coastal restoration projects, salt marsh restoration projects. There's a lot of work going on in, increasing the coverage of our hedgerows. And hedgerows are incredibly important because they connect ecosystems and allow species to move through landscapes, which is important. And to climate change, there's all sorts of both private and public organisations that are bringing nature into our cities, that are involving school children, young people from different backgrounds in the process of restoring nature and also restoring their mental and physical health at the same time. I've been incredibly encouraged. I'm in the process of producing a series of short documentaries on nature-based solutions and action around the UK. And I've been incredibly impressed by the efforts that many organisations are putting into trying to repair our damaged ecosystems and show the rest of the world that we are also committed to working with nature. Clearly, a lot more funding is needed to those projects. A lot of those projects are working on tiny budgets and still achieving amazing amounts. Rewilding in a way that's compatible with the interests of farmers and local communities. In other words, economically viable plans for rewilding. There's a lot of great work going on in the Highlands of Scotland, projects that are really good for nature, for carbon, for biodiversity, for water, but also for local farmers. And I think the work that's being done where local farmers and local communities are being involved right from the get-go is the most important work that's going on. And there are dozens and dozens. I wouldn't want to point at any one particular, but there's a lot of work all over the country going on and restoring what is a very, very degraded landscape and showing, as I said, that we are serious about.
I think you've given us an idea of the range of what's going on, Natalie. Could I come back in with some questions that have come in? One from Tom here. And the question is, how do we, and he uses quote marks here, score nature-based solutions given all the variables in play? By what he means relative to carbon reduction, where in principle there's one number to work towards. That doesn't sound like it's the case with NBS. So how would we actually rate or score the kind of things you're talking about?
Well, those projects that are able to support biodiversity, so whilst also supporting carbon, whilst also providing livelihoods, those are the types of projects that involve a range of different ecosystems that have high integrity, that have lots of species in them, that are being implemented, as I say, in consultation with local communities, that have been funded through mechanisms that aren't being used to greenwash the activities of the funders. So it's important that both the supply and the demand around nature-based solutions, that there's high integrity on both parts of it. So projects that score highly meet all those criteria. What doesn't score well, would be top-down implemented, landscape scale, single species plantations, which are very good potentially over the short term to provide wood products, but not a long-term climate solution. And you asked me about bad practice, and that would be an example of where that kind of activity is being rebadged as a nature-based solution, but in many contexts it's not. It's only a good solution if there's absolutely nothing else that can be done with that.
What are sometimes called the kind of Conifer Deserts, where you have just one type of fir tree and that dominates the landscape.
Absolutely, they're often very bad for water security as well as biodiversity, and you can see from the fires, which incidentally are raging through very degraded ecosystems, through plantations. If you looked at where the fires occurred in the world, it isn't those intact, really well managed, well looked after ecosystems that are burning. It is poorly managed ecosystems, very badly degraded landscapes that are suffering. So that's carbon going back into the atmosphere. So
okay, thank you. And I think you've actually managed to answer the question that came in from Alan, which was about whether different types of trees are necessary to get the best effect. I think you're making it clear that that is the case. Let me squeeze in one here from Kizzy B. And Kizzy asks, I heard Greta, she's so famous now we just need to say Greta, we all know who that is, say that we spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on nature-based solutions. Is that true?
I don't know about the specific figures, so I'm not going, but we do spend, in order to scale up nature-based solutions, we have to eliminate supporting fossil fuel production and new fossil fuel projects. So we need to stop subsidizing those on the one hand, because unless we stop fossil fuel use, unless we rapidly decarbonize, the warming that will result will cause all sorts of chaos across the economy and across our ecosystems, and undermine the capacity of nature to draw down and store carbon for the long term. But also we have to think about other subsidies. So lots of subsidies go towards a very high proportion of the global expenditure on subsidies go to agriculture, particularly high emitting commodity production. And that's why I mentioned that in my last slide. It's really important to defund that and repurpose those agricultural subsidies towards more sustainable land practices, towards much more ecosystem stewardship. So we need to do both those things. So we do need to channel more investment to nature-based solutions, but there's almost no point in doing that if we're also, maintaining high levels of support through subsidies and other mechanisms for practices that lock in that long-term damage to the biosphere and the climate.
Absolutely. So let me, as we begin to come to the end, perhaps in the spirit of the famous Greta, put forward quite a practical question that comes into us from George. And George says, first of all, you'll be pleased to hear, I hope, Natalie, enjoying and appreciating the importance of Professor Seddon's talk. But then her or his question is, I just wish, though, each of us could make a difference. Does Natalie have suggestions on what we each can do? And that is the question of whether or not, as individuals, as opposed to as societies or countries, are there things we should be doing? What's your kind of forward-looking suggestion on that?
Well, ultimately, we do need systemic change in our relationship with the natural world. And we need systemic change in our relationship with each other and with our bodies. And we need to embrace a lot of individual change to enable that to happen, to free up land, for example, for ecosystem restoration, to increase carbon absorption, to protect biodiversity. We do need to be shifting towards a plant-based diet. And that is an individual choice that we make. This is, hard in some parts of the world, much easier in others. In those parts of the world where this is an easy choice to make, we should be making that choice. That's something that we can do, and we influence our network. It's a healthy choice for our bodies, and it's also a very, very important choice for the planet. Obviously, patterns of consumption need to come down. We need to be happier, and we will indeed be happier with a lot less. We need to engage and keep our children connected with the natural world. In my experience, in my world, children are sort of born with an innate connection with the natural world. We need to somehow work bringing nature into schools, natural history on the curriculum. We need to keep that connection with nature. We are part of nature, and that is what the nature-based solutions approach acknowledges. We are healthier and are happier when we're in nature. The neurophysiology and science underpinning that is very, very well understood. We all know it from our personal experiences, and it was interesting that the COVID experience for many of us involved recognizing how much we valued the natural world. A lot more people with allotments and so forth, at least in this part of the world. So it's like really, really important. We can make those individual choices. And then if you obviously practically want to get involved, you get in touch with your local wildlife group, whether you live in a city or if you live in rural areas, and they're all doing this. They're all implementing nature-based solutions, doing hedgerows, wetland restoration, tree planting at the weekend. It's a fun thing to do. So there is so much we can do, and we can all be part of this movement towards being in a more sustainable world. And as the more we do, the more pressures we put on companies by choosing products that have lower impacts on the environment, then the more the companies will have to respond to that and provide more products that are clean or much cleaner anyway.
Well, could I just the last moment there, they've got a couple of questions that are coming right at the end, and I think in a sense they speak directly to that. It sounds as if you might be a little skeptical about the question, or at least the premise of the question that Jaya has just sent in. Jaya said, what do you think about people planting trees when they go on planes? Is that good practice? I'm guessing you're probably going to say probably better not to be on the planes in the first place, but you tell me, Natalie.
We all have to fly less. That's one of the many things we have to do. If we absolutely have to fly, if there are good reasons for that, then there are ways of, I hesitate to use the word offsetting, but there are good and less good schemes for doing so. You can't justify continued flying because you've offset your flight and tree planting. However, there are some companies have got very good schemes, and that's what I was saying. It's like, if there are those types of offsetting schemes, we need to make sure that the funding that you put into offsetting goes to those projects that are biodiversity based and people led, and not just to a commercial forestry plantation, for example.
I'm almost hesitant to throw the last question to you, which comes in from Lucy T, because you could either plunge us into gloom or give us optimism on the way out, but I'll put it to you anyway, and you decide which direction you'll take us at the end here, Natalie. Lucy T asks, what's happening in Brazil with the rainforests? Deforestation, of course, I'm sure she means. Undermines all of our work in the UK on this, doesn't it? Does it?
Obviously, what happens in Brazil is of global significance, and before the present administration, there was a lot of really positive news from Brazil. that when there is political will, when there are things in place like a soil moratorium, they can dramatically cut rates of deforestation. So, before the recent administration, Brazil was a positive story in the sense that we saw economic growth whilst also increased protections of what is arguably the most important ecosystem, the Amazon rainforest on the planet. What we've seen is that where the political will declines, then where political will declines, then yes, the rates of deforestation goes up. However, there's then a role for people in the private sector to step in to ensure that we're not so vulnerable to that volatility at an administrative level. And throughout Brazil, despite the challenges they face, there's also a lot of private and NGO organizations that are also improving their approaches so that they can step up to try and work with funding and support from the rest of the world, of course. They can try and maintain efforts to restore and protect these important ecosystems. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing that's happening.
So that little shaft of light amidst the gloom there, which is always helpful. Just a reminder to everyone before we finish that you can find links to all the talks in this Conversations About COP series on the webpage, which is listed in the description just below the video if you're watching on YouTube or something similar. And also that next week we'll be back here Thursday the 14th of October, same time, 12:45 p.m. British summer time, to ask what do countries need to agree to at COP26, and we have the political scientist Dr. Tom Hale from the Blavatnik School of Government with us for that. But I'd like to end today with thanks. First of all, thanks to our audience from around the world for joining us for COP Conversations here at Oxford University. Second, to the team behind the scenes who have made all the technology happen so magically, and of course saved huge amounts of carbon by not flying us around to do the talks, but doing it on Zoom. And last but by no means least, our brilliant speaker today, many thanks to Professor Nathalie Seddon. Thank you all, everyone. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and see you same time next week.